Sometimes the most loyal hearts carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes a dog's love can outlast 20 years of silence. When you've lost everything that matters, you learn to recognize that same emptiness in another soul's eyes. Jake Morrison lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, far from the world that had taken too much from him. One evening, a bleeding German shepherd stumbled into his camp, and something in the animal's desperate gaze told him this wasn't just another lost creature. The dog led him north, through rough country to an abandoned ranch, where the walls were scarred with bullet holes and a child's doll sat forgotten in the dust. The shepherd's growl at the threshold warned Jake that whatever had happened here wasn't over. What terrible secret had this faithful dog been protecting all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison had been living in the high country for 7 years, and in all that time, he'd grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of solitude. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of aspen trees at 8,000 feet, where the air carried the clean scent of pine, and the only sounds were wind through the branches and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. It was September now, and the aspens had begun their slow turn to gold, painting the mountainside in shades that reminded him why he'd chosen this place to heal. The morning routine never varied. Coffee before dawn, black and strong, while he watched the sun creep over the eastern peaks. Then he'd check his snares, tend to his small garden, and spend the afternoon hunting or fishing, depending on what his larder needed. Evening brought wood splitting, equipment maintenance, and the careful inventory of supplies that meant the difference between comfort and survival when winter locked down the high country. He'd been a medic in Afghanistan, part of a forward operating base that saw more action than most. 3 tours had taught him to patch bullet wounds in the dark, to keep men breathing when everything inside them wanted to quit, and to carry the weight of those he couldn't save. The mountains had called to him when he returned stateside, promising silence where there had been too much noise, space where there had been too little room to breathe. Jake's hands still moved with the precision of his medical training, whether he was cleaning a fish or splinting a bird's broken wing. The muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. Gentle pressure here, steady support there, always moving with deliberate care. It was a gift that had saved lives in the desert heat and continued to serve him in these quieter moments when injured animals found their way to his camp. The dog tags hung beneath his flannel shirt, worn smooth by years of worry and remembrance. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison, 75th Ranger Regiment medic. The metal was warm against his chest, a reminder of the man he'd been before the mountains claimed him. Some nights, when the wind howled through the peaks, he could still hear the helicopter rotors and feel the sand between his teeth. But most days, the silence held those memories at bay. That September evening started like any other. Jake had spent the day checking his trap lines higher up the mountain, finding only an old beaver dam that needed clearing if he wanted to improve the fishing downstream. The work had taken longer than expected, and twilight was settling over the valley by the time he made it back to camp. He'd built his fire in the stone ring he'd constructed his first year here, the flames casting dancing shadows against the cabin walls. The German shepherd appeared like a ghost, materializing from the timber. One moment Jake was alone, stirring beans in his cast-iron pot, and the next he was reaching slowly for his rifle as a large, dark shape stumbled into the circle of firelight. The dog's front left leg dragged useless, and blood matted the fur along its side. But it was the animal's eyes that stopped Jake cold, intelligent, desperate, and filled with a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "Easy there." "Oh boy," Jake murmured, setting his rifle aside and rising slowly. The dog didn't run, though every instinct should have told it to flee from this strange human. Instead, it sank to its haunches and fixed Jake with a stare that seemed to hold 20 years of waiting. Jake approached with the careful movements he'd used in field hospitals, hands visible, voice steady and low. "Let's have a look at you." The dog submitted to his examination with surprising trust, as if it understood that help had finally arrived. The leg was badly torn, likely from a fall or a tangle with something sharp, but the wound was clean and not infected. More concerning were the older scars Jake found beneath the matted fur, evidence of a hard life lived in the wild. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you?" Jake spoke as he worked, his medic's bag producing bandages and antiseptic. "Long time for a dog like you to be running alone." The German Shepherd was a magnificent animal, despite its condition. Beneath the dirt and scars, Jake could see the breeding, strong shoulders, intelligent eyes, the kind of dog that belonged with a family, not struggling to survive in the wilderness. Its coat was the classic black and tan, though dulled by exposure and hardship. When Jake ran his hands along the dog's flanks, he could feel the ridges of ribs beneath the fur. This animal had been hungry for a long time. As Jake cleaned and bandaged the wound, the dog remained perfectly still, occasionally whimpering, but never snapping or pulling away. It watched Jake's every movement with an intensity that suggested it was memorizing his face, cataloging his scent, filing away every detail of this human who showed kindness instead of fear. "There," Jake said finally, securing the last of the bandages. "That should hold you together while it heals. But you need food more than anything." He returned to his pot of beans, ladling half his dinner into a spare bowl. The dog approached cautiously, sniffed once, then began eating with the careful efficiency of an animal that had learned not to waste any opportunity. Jake settled back against a log, watching his unexpected guest. "Been alone out here 7 years," he said conversationally, "and you're the first visitor who's stayed for dinner." The dog's ears flicked at his voice, but it continued eating. "Question is, where'd you come from? Nearest ranch is 40 miles down the valley, and you didn't walk 40 miles on that leg." The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks into the star-filled sky. Jake added another log and considered his situation. He'd chosen isolation deliberately, built his life around avoiding complications and unwanted connections. But something about this dog's presence felt different from the random encounters with lost hikers or injured wildlife he'd helped over the years. There was purpose in the animal's bearing, intelligence in its eyes, that suggested this meeting wasn't entirely accidental. "Got yourself into some trouble, didn't you?" Jake continued, his voice carrying the tone he'd once used to calm wounded soldiers. "Been carrying something heavy for a long time." The dog finished eating and moved closer to the fire, settling down with a deep sigh that seemed to come from its bones. "Yeah, I know that feeling." The night settled around them with the particular quiet that only came in high country, where civilization felt like a distant memory. Jake dozed fitfully, his military training keeping him partially alert even in sleep. Several times he woke to find the dog's eyes reflecting the dying firelight, watching him with an intensity that suggested the animal was making its own assessments. When dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jake woke to find the German Shepherd standing at the edge of camp, staring north toward the higher peaks. Its bandaged leg held weight better than the night before, and its posture radiated determination. When it noticed Jake stirring, it looked back at him with unmistakable expectation. "You want to go somewhere," Jake observed, sitting up in his sleeping bag. The dog's tail wagged once, a controlled movement that seemed to say, "Yes, this human finally understands." "North by the look of it, into some rough country." Jake made coffee and shared his breakfast of jerky and hardtack with his guest, all the while studying the animal's behavior. Every few minutes the dog would look north, then back at Jake, then north again. The message was clear. It wanted Jake to follow. "Been 7 years since I went looking for trouble," Jake mused, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Came up here to get away from other people's problems." But even as he said it, he was already mentally inventorying his gear, planning for a journey into unknown country. Something about the dog's desperate intelligence had gotten under his skin, awakened the part of him that had once answered every call for help. No matter how dangerous, the German Shepherd sensed his wavering and pressed closer, placing its massive head against Jake's leg. The gesture was both a request and a promise. Trust me, and I'll show you something that matters." Jake looked into those dark eyes and saw his own reflection, saw the same mix of pain and determination that had driven him into these mountains years ago. "All right," he said finally, "but if we're going into the high country, we do it smart. No rushing, and we turn back if that leg gives you trouble." The dog's tail wagged twice this time, and Jake could swear he saw relief in its expression. As he broke camp and loaded his pack with supplies for several days in the backcountry, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was about to end. 7 years of peace, of healing, of learning to live with his memories instead of running from them. Now this wounded animal was asking him to step back into a world where his choices might matter to someone other than himself. The dog watched his preparations with patient attention, occasionally limping over to nose at pieces of equipment as if offering approval. When Jake shouldered his pack and picked up his rifle, the German Shepherd moved to his side, positioning itself slightly ahead and to the left, the perfect spot for a guide. "Lead on." "Then," Jake said, and together they started north, into country that would test them both before they found whatever truth the dog had been guarding all these lonely years. The journey north tested both man and dog in ways Jake hadn't anticipated. The German Shepherd, despite its injury, moved with the steady determination of an animal following a map burned into its memory. They climbed through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers, loose scree slopes that shifted under every step, narrow ledges where a stumble meant 100-foot fall, and dense timber so thick that noon felt like twilight. Jake found himself impressed by his companion's endurance. The bandaged leg slowed their progress, but never stopped it entirely. When the grade became too steep, the dog would find switchbacks that weren't visible to human eyes. When they reached dead ends, it would backtrack without frustration, seeking another route with the patience of something that had made this journey many times before. Always alone. On the first night, they camped in a small clearing beside a stream that tumbled down from the peaks above. Jake built a small fire and shared his rations, watching the dog's behavior for signs of where they might be heading. The animal's attention remained fixed northward, toward ridges that disappeared into cloud cover and country that few humans had ever seen. "You know exactly where we're going, don't you?" Jake asked, offering the dog a piece of dried meat. Those intelligent eyes met his, and for a moment he felt the strange sensation that he was being evaluated, measured against some standard he couldn't understand. "Been making this trip alone for years, I'd guess. Waiting for someone to follow you." The second day brought them above the tree line, into a landscape of stone and sky where the air grew thin and the wind carried the bite of early winter. The dog's pace never faltered, though Jake noticed it would occasionally pause at certain landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a small cairn someone had built years ago, as if checking its navigation against familiar markers. It was late afternoon when they crested a ridge, and Jake saw their destination spread out below. The valley was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 2 miles long and half as wide, with a lake of impossible blue at its center. But what drew his attention was the cluster of buildings on the lake's eastern shore, a ranch complex that had once been substantial, now clearly abandoned to time and weather. The German Shepherd's behavior changed the moment the ranch came into view. Its ears flattened against its skull, and a low whine escaped its throat. The animal's entire body tensed, as if the sight below triggered memories too painful to bear. Jake knelt beside his companion, studying the buildings through his binoculars. "That's it, isn't it?" he said quietly. "That's where you've been trying to get back to." The ranch had the bones of prosperity. A large main house with a wraparound porch. Several outbuildings, including what looked like a substantial barn, and fencing that had once enclosed pastures stretching to the water's edge. But decay had taken its toll. The porch sagged under the weight of collapsed sections of roof, the barn doors hung askew on broken hinges, and the fencing had fallen in so many places that it looked like broken teeth scattered across the landscape. As they descended toward the valley floor, the dog's agitation increased. It would forge ahead, then return to Jake's side, then move forward again, as if torn between the need to reach their destination and reluctance to relive whatever waited there. Jake found himself moving more cautiously too, his military training beginning to assert itself as they approached the ranch. Something felt wrong about the place beyond simple abandonment. There was a quality to the silence that reminded Jake of villages in Afghanistan where everyone had fled, leaving behind only the echo of violence. The buildings seemed to crouch against the landscape, and shadows gathered in corners where they shouldn't yet exist so early in the day. They reached the property line marked by a fallen gate, its wooden posts rotted through at the base. The German shepherd stopped completely here, hackles rising as it stared at the main house. Jake could feel the animal trembling against his leg, and he placed a reassuring hand on its head. "Easy, boy. We'll take this slow." The approach to the house revealed more troubling details. Windows were broken, some boarded up with weathered planks that suggested hasty repairs made long ago. The front door hung open, revealing darkness beyond the threshold. But it was the porch that made Jake's blood run cold. Dark stains on the wooden planks that weather hadn't been able to wash away, and gouges in the wood that looked disturbingly like bullet holes. The dog led him around the house to what had once been a kitchen garden. Here, scattered among the weeds and volunteer saplings, Jake found the first clear evidence of violence. Spent brass casings, green with age but unmistakable. Someone had fired multiple rounds here, and from the scatter pattern, it hadn't been target practice. Inside the house, the story became clearer and more horrifying. Furniture was overturned throughout the main room, with more dark stains on the walls and floor. A cabinet had been ransacked, its contents scattered, but it was in what had obviously been a child's bedroom that Jake found the artifact that would haunt him. A small brass locket lying on the dusty floor beside an overturned bed. The locket was tarnished but intact, and when Jake opened it, he found a family photograph. A man in a sheriff's uniform stood beside a woman with kind eyes, their arms around a girl who couldn't have been more than 10. The child's smile was bright and trusting, captured in a moment when the world still made sense and her family was whole. The German shepherd had followed him into the room and now sat beside the locket, whining softly. Jake looked at the dog with new understanding. This was your family, wasn't it? The little girl, she was yours. The animal's response was unmistakable. It moved to where the bed had once stood and lay down, placing its head on its paws in the posture of a dog that had waited beside that bed many times before. Jake felt something twist in his chest as he realized the depth of loyalty that had kept this animal returning to this place. Year after year, guarding memories that no one else was left to honor. But as Jake continued his examination of the house, he found evidence that troubled him even more than the signs of old violence. In the kitchen, beneath a layer of dust, were boot prints that couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Someone had been here recently, and they'd been methodical about it, opening cabinets, moving furniture, searching for something. Outside, behind the barn where the dog had initially led him, Jake found tire tracks pressed into what had once been a paddock. The tracks were fresh enough that morning dew still outlined their edges. Someone had been using this supposedly abandoned ranch, and recently the German shepherd seemed to sense his growing unease. It moved restlessly from building to building, nose working the air, occasionally growling at scents that Jake couldn't detect. When they reached the barn, the dog's agitation peaked. It paced before the entrance, whining and looking back at Jake as if trying to communicate urgency. Inside the barn, Jake understood why. Hidden beneath old hay and debris, he found more evidence of the property's violent past and its troubling present. A sheriff's badge, tarnished and bent, lay concealed in what had once been a feed bin. The nameplate was still readable: Thomas J. Clearwater, Sheriff, Teton County, but more disturbing were the signs of recent activity. The hay had been moved and replaced, but not carefully. Hidden beneath it, Jake found camping supplies, sleeping bags, canned food, and other equipment that suggested someone had been using the barn as a base of operations. The equipment was expensive and well-maintained. not the gear of drifters or casual trespassers. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Jake realized they had stumbled into something far more complex than an old tragedy. The German shepherd's 20-year vigil had led them to a place where past violence intersected with present danger, where someone was still invested enough in old secrets to return again and again. The dog seemed to understand that Jake was finally beginning to grasp the situation. It led him to one final location, a spot near the lakeshore where the earth had been disturbed. The grave was old, but not ancient, marked only by a cairn of stones that blended with the natural landscape. Someone was buried here, and Jake was beginning to suspect it might not be the only grave hidden in this beautiful, terrible valley. As darkness gathered over the ranch, Jake made the decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating to safety, instead of returning to his comfortable isolation in the mountains, he would stay. The German shepherd had waited 20 years for someone to find this place and understand what had happened here. Jake Morrison, former army medic and reluctant hermit, was going to make sure that wait hadn't been in vain. The dog seemed to sense his resolve. For the first time since Jake had met the animal, its tail wagged with something that looked like hope. Jake spent a restless night in the main house, his military training keeping him alert to every sound that drifted across the valley. The German shepherd positioned itself by the broken front door, ears constantly moving as it monitored the darkness beyond. Neither man nor dog found much sleep in a place where so much violence had occurred. Dawn brought with it a decision that Jake had been wrestling with since finding the sheriff's badge. He could pack up, take the dog, and return to his mountain sanctuary, leaving the mysteries of Clearwater Ranch to remain buried. Or he could do what every instinct from his military service was telling him to do: investigate, understand, and, if possible, bring some measure of justice to whatever had happened here. The choice became clearer as he watched his canine companion that morning. The German shepherd moved through the ruins of what had once been its home, with the careful steps of something performing a ritual. It visited each room, paused at specific locations, and occasionally whined softly, as if mourning losses that were still fresh despite the passage of 20 years. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," Jake said, kneeling beside the dog as it stood in what had been the little girl's bedroom. Time someone else knew the truth. His first step was to learn more about the official version of events. The nearest town was Millfield, 40 miles down the mountain by truck, assuming Jake could find the old logging road that connected to the valley. But before he risked leaving the ranch, he needed to understand what they were dealing with. The barn proved to be where Sheriff Clearwater had hidden more than just his badge. Working methodically through the old feed bins and equipment storage areas, Jake found what the dog had been trying to show him: a waterproof container wedged deep into the building's foundation. Inside was a treasure trove of information that Sheriff Thomas Clearwater had compiled in the weeks before his death. The hidden investigation file painted a picture of systematic cattle theft that went far beyond simple rustling. According to Clearwater's meticulous notes, someone was running an organized operation that involved altering brands, forging ownership documents, and moving stolen cattle through a network that reached across 3 states. The sheriff had identified patterns in missing livestock reports, traced false shipping manifests, and even obtained photographs of altered brands that served as evidence of the crimes. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the list of names in Clearwater's file. The investigation hadn't focused on small-time thieves or desperate ranchers. It had targeted some of the most prominent families in the county. The Morrison Ranch, no relation to Jake despite the shared name, appeared repeatedly in the sheriff's notes, along with the Blackwood and Henley operations. These weren't struggling outfits looking to make ends meet. They were established dynasties that controlled thousands of acres and carried significant political influence. As Jake read through the sheriff's investigation, he began to understand why Thomas Clearwater and his family had been murdered rather than simply intimidated. The cattle theft operation was a front for something much larger, a systematic effort to drive smaller ranchers out of business so their land could be acquired at distressed prices. The sheriff hadn't just stumbled onto rustling. He'd uncovered a conspiracy that threatened to reshape the ownership of the entire valley. The German shepherd watched Jake read, occasionally moving to different parts of the barn as if guiding his attention to specific locations. At one such spot, beneath a loose floorboard that the dog nosed insistently, Jake found additional evidence that chilled him. Photographs showed cattle bearing the legitimate brands of small ranchers, alongside identical animals whose brands had been expertly altered to indicate ownership by the larger operations. Your sheriff was thorough, Jake murmured to the dog. No wonder they had to stop him permanently, but the most disturbing discovery came when Jake found a list of other ranching families who had sold out to the larger operations in the years surrounding the Clearwater murders. According to the sheriff's research, 13 smaller ranches had been absorbed by the Morrison, Blackwood, and Henley operations between 1998 and 2005. The sales had all been described as voluntary, families choosing to leave ranching for financial or personal reasons. Jake was beginning to suspect that not all of those departures had been voluntary. The investigation file also contained maps showing the strategic value of different properties within the valley system. The Clearwater Ranch occupied a crucial position. It controlled access to water rights that served the entire northern section of the valley, and its elimination would allow the larger operations to essentially monopolize grazing and water access for thousands of acres. As afternoon approached, Jake made the decision to risk a trip to Millfield. He needed to research the official records, find out what story had been told about the Clearwater family's disappearance, and understand what had happened to their property in the years since their deaths. The German shepherd clearly wanted to remain at the ranch, so Jake prepared to make the trip alone. But as he gathered his gear for the journey down the mountain, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. It began pacing frantically, moving between Jake and the barn, whining and occasionally barking, the first sounds Jake had heard it make beyond soft whimpers. The animal's agitation was so intense that Jake paused to reconsider his plans. "What is it, boy? You trying to tell me something?" The dog led him back to the barn, then to a specific stall that Jake had examined earlier but dismissed as empty. This time, guided by the animal's focused attention, Jake looked more carefully. Hidden beneath years of accumulated hay and debris, he found evidence that someone else had been conducting their own investigation of the sheriff's work. The camping equipment Jake had discovered wasn't random. It belonged to someone who had been systematically searching the barn, methodically going through every possible hiding place. They had found and examined the sheriff's badge, photographed documents, and taken detailed notes about the layout of the property. Most disturbing of all, they had been doing this work recently and regularly. Based on the wear patterns in their hidden camp, Jake realized with growing unease that he and the German shepherd weren't the only ones interested in the truth about what had happened at Clearwater Ranch. Someone else was already investigating. Someone with resources and patience who had been coming here regularly. The question was whether that someone was trying to expose the truth or cover it up more completely. As he examined the hidden campsite more carefully, Jake found something that answered that question in the most chilling way possible. Scattered among the camping supplies were surveillance photographs, recent images of the ranch taken from various angles, including shots of the grave site by the lake and detailed pictures of the interior of the house. Someone had been watching this place, documenting it, preparing for something, and based on the freshness of the tire tracks outside, they would likely be back soon. The German shepherd seemed to understand Jake's growing tension. It moved to his side and leaned against his leg, offering the comfort of presence while communicating its own readiness for whatever might come. After 20 years of solitary vigilance, the dog had found an ally, and together they would face whatever danger was approaching the valley. Jake made his decision. The trip to Millfield would have to wait. If someone was using Clearwater Ranch as a base for ongoing operations, if the people responsible for the original murders were still active, then leaving the valley now would mean abandoning any chance of justice. The German shepherd had waited 2 decades for someone to understand what had happened here. Jake Morrison, former army medic and reluctant hermit, was going to make sure that wait hadn't been in vain. Jake decided to make the ranch house his base of operations, at least temporarily. The building's solid log construction provided better protection than camping in the open, and its elevated position gave him clear sightlines across the valley approaches. More importantly, the German shepherd seemed calmer when they remained close to what had once been its home. While establishing his defensive position, Jake discovered that his canine companion had more secrets to share. The dog led him to a loose stone in the house's foundation, behind which Sheriff Clearwater had hidden his most sensitive investigation materials. The waterproof packet contained documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Jake was beginning to uncover. The hidden journal made for sobering reading. Sheriff Clearwater had been investigating not just cattle theft, but a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence directed against small ranchers throughout the region. His notes documented cases of mysterious accidents, suspicious fires, and economic pressures that had forced family operations to sell out to larger interests. The pattern suggested coordination at a level that went far beyond simple criminal enterprise. Your dad was a thorough investigator, Jake told the German shepherd as he read through the sheriff's meticulous documentation. He knew this was bigger than rustling. He was tracking organized crime with political connections. The journal's most damning entries dealt with the Morrison Ranch operation, owned by a family that had built their empire through what appeared to be a combination of legitimate business and systematic elimination of competition. Harold Morrison had arrived in the valley 30 years earlier with modest resources, but had somehow acquired enough capital to purchase distressed properties at below-market rates whenever smaller operators encountered financial difficulties. According to Sheriff Clearwater's research, those financial difficulties weren't always natural market forces. Ranchers who refused to sell found themselves facing problems that escalated in predictable patterns. First equipment failures and minor vandalism, then more serious incidents like hay fires or cattle stampedes, and finally direct threats or unexplained accidents. The sheriff had documented a dozen cases where stubborn holdouts had eventually experienced accidents that forced sales or led to their properties being inherited by family members. Eager to liquidate and leave the area, the German shepherd grew restless as Jake read, periodically moving to the windows and doors to check the approaches to the house. Its behavior suggested the animal had learned to associate the ranch with danger, and that danger could return at any time. Jake found himself grateful for the dog's vigilance as he became absorbed in the sheriff's investigation. The journal also contained detailed maps showing how the various land acquisitions had created a consolidated empire covering most of the valley's best grazing and water rights. The Clearwater Ranch had represented the final piece needed to complete total control of the northern watershed. With the sheriff's property absorbed into the Morrison Empire, Harold Morrison would effectively control access to water for every remaining independent operator in the region. But what transformed Jake's understanding of the situation was the journal's final entry, dated just 3 days before the murders. Sheriff Clearwater had discovered that the land consolidation wasn't the end goal. It was preparation for something much larger. Hidden in the county planning office records, the sheriff had found preliminary surveys for a major development project that would transform the entire valley into a luxury resort complex. The development plans were staggering in scope. The proposed Teton Valley Resort would feature 2 championship golf courses, a 5-star hotel complex, luxury condominiums, and recreational facilities that would attract wealthy visitors from across the country. The economic impact would be enormous, generating hundreds of millions in development profits for whoever controlled the necessary land. Jake felt pieces clicking into place as he understood the true motive behind the murders. This wasn't about cattle theft or even simple land acquisition. It was about positioning for one of the largest development opportunities in Wyoming history. The Morrison family and their associates hadn't been stealing cattle. They had been systematically acquiring development rights that would be worth a fortune. Once the resort project moved forward, the German Shepherd's sudden alertness broke Jake's concentration. The dog had frozen by the front window, ears forward and hackles raised, staring toward the valley's southern approach. Jake moved carefully to observe what had caught the animal's attention. 3 vehicles were moving up the valley road, still distant but approaching steadily. Jake used his binoculars to study the convoy. 2 pickup trucks and what looked like a utility vehicle, all moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of tourists or hunters. The lead truck was white with government plates that Jake couldn't read at this distance, but something about the formation suggested official business. "Company coming," Jake murmured to the dog. "Question is, are they friendly or not?" The German Shepherd's continued agitation suggested the answer wasn't reassuring. Jake quickly gathered the sheriff's documents and returned them to their hiding place, then prepared for visitors who might not appreciate finding someone camped in the supposedly abandoned ranch. As the vehicles drew closer, Jake could see that their occupants were taking the same systematic approach to surveying the property that he had observed in the hidden campsite. They stopped at several locations to examine the buildings and grounds, taking photographs and making notes. This wasn't a casual visit. It was a professional assessment. The lead vehicle finally parked near the main house, and Jake got his first clear look at his visitors. 3 men emerged from the trucks, dressed in the kind of practical outdoor clothing that suggested they were comfortable working in remote locations. One carried what appeared to be surveying equipment, while another had a clipboard and camera. The third man seemed to be supervising the other 2, directing their attention to specific features of the property. From his concealed position inside the house, Jake watched the men work. They measured distances between buildings, photographed structural details, and paid particular attention to the areas where Jake had found evidence of the original violence. Most disturbing of all, they seemed familiar with the property layout, moving with the confidence of people who had been here before. The German Shepherd remained frozen beside Jake, every muscle tensed for action. The dog's reaction confirmed what Jake's instincts were telling him. These men represented danger, not help. They were part of whatever ongoing operation was still connected to Clearwater Ranch, and their presence meant that Jake and the dog had stumbled into something that was very much alive and active. When the men finished their survey and departed, Jake realized that his comfortable isolation had officially ended. The ranch wasn't just a historical crime scene. It was still an active location for whatever conspiracy had killed the Clearwater family 20 years ago. He and the German Shepherd were no longer investigating old mysteries. They were witnessing current criminal activity. The dog seemed to understand that the situation had changed. It moved to Jake's side and placed its head against his leg, offering comfort while communicating readiness for whatever would come next. After 20 years of solitary vigilance, it had found an ally who was prepared to fight for justice. Jake Morrison, former Army medic, was about to discover that some battles never really end. They just wait for the right soldiers to finish them. After the surveyors departed, Jake spent the remainder of the day conducting his own thorough exploration of the ranch, guided by the German Shepherd's intimate knowledge of every building and hiding place. It was in Sarah Clearwater's bedroom that they made the discovery that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. The music box sat beneath a collapsed section of ceiling, protected from the worst of the weather by the debris that had fallen around it. When Jake carefully extracted it from the rubble, the German Shepherd's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The animal began to whine softly, a sound of pure grief that seemed to come from depths Jake hadn't known existed in any creature. The music box was a delicate thing, painted with faded roses and clearly treasured by the child who had owned it. When Jake wound the mechanism, it played Amazing Grace in notes that rang clear and sweet, despite 20 years of abandonment. The melody filled the ruined bedroom with ghostly beauty, and the German shepherd's whining transformed into something that could only be described as crying. She loved this song, didn't she? Jake asked softly, kneeling beside the grieving animal. Your little girl, as if summoned by the music, memories seemed to flood back through the dog. Jake watched in fascination as his companion began to demonstrate behaviors that clearly belonged to a different time and place. The German shepherd moved to where the bed had once stood and performed the ritual of turning in circles before lying down, the evening routine of a dog preparing to sleep beside its beloved child. Then, as the music box wound down and silence returned to the room, something extraordinary happened. The dog began to communicate its memories to Jake through a series of actions that were unmistakably deliberate. It moved to the window and stood on its hind legs, paws on the sill, recreating the posture of watching for someone's return. Then it moved to what had been the closet and sat in the alert position Jake had seen search and rescue dogs use, waiting for a command that would never come. You were her dog, Jake realized. Not the family's dog, hers specifically. She trained you, didn't she? The German shepherd's tail wagged once, a controlled movement that seemed to confirm Jake's understanding. As if encouraged by his recognition, the dog began to show Jake more memories. It led him to the kitchen, where it demonstrated the behavior of a dog begging for table scraps. Then to the front porch, where it lay down in the exact position where a family pet would wait for the school bus to bring its child home. But it was what the dog showed him next that broke Jake's heart and filled in the crucial details of what had happened that terrible night 20 years ago. Moving to the living room, the German shepherd recreated a scene of alarm and protection. It positioned itself between Jake and the front door, hackles raised, demonstrating the stance of a dog defending its family against intruders. Then the animal moved to a corner of the room and cowered, favoring the same leg that Jake had bandaged, showing him how it had been wounded while trying to protect the people it loved. The performance was so vivid that Jake could almost see the gunman bursting through the door, the family's terrified attempts to escape, and the loyal dog's desperate effort to defend them against impossible odds. You saw it all, Jake whispered. You were there when they came. You tried to save them. The German shepherd approached Jake and gently took his hand in its mouth, not biting, but holding it with the careful pressure of an animal delivering a message. When Jake looked into those intelligent eyes, he saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion. This wasn't just grief or loyalty, it was hope. For the first time in 20 years, someone understood what had happened, and more importantly, someone might be able to do something about it. Jake spent the evening reading more of Sheriff Clearwater's hidden files by lamplight, while the German shepherd maintained its vigil by the windows. The deeper he dug into the sheriff's investigation, the more complex and dangerous the conspiracy appeared. The land acquisition scheme wasn't just about resort development. It was about creating a criminal empire that could operate with virtual impunity, the sheriffs. Notes revealed that Harold Morrison had connections that reached far beyond local politics. He had relationships with state-level officials who could influence environmental permits, zoning decisions, and water rights allocations. He had financial backing from out-of-state investors who specialized in large-scale development projects with questionable environmental and social impacts. Most troubling of all, he had law enforcement contacts who could ensure that investigations into his methods were discouraged or misdirected. One entry in particular caught Jake's attention. Sheriff Clearwater had documented a meeting between Harold Morrison and a man identified only as the Denver Connection, someone who apparently provided both financial backing and political protection for Morrison's operations. The sheriff had managed to photograph this meeting from a distance, and his notes suggested that this individual was the real power behind the land consolidation scheme. As Jake studied the photograph, He began to understand why Sheriff Clearwater and his family had been murdered rather than simply intimidated. The sheriff hadn't just uncovered local corruption. He had stumbled onto a criminal network with connections that could destroy careers and lives at the state and possibly federal level. His investigation represented a threat that couldn't be managed through ordinary intimidation. The German shepherd's sudden alertness interrupted Jake's reading. The dog moved to the front window and assumed its warning posture, staring into the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. Jake extinguished his lamp and joined the animal at the window, but he could see nothing in the moonless night that might have triggered its concern. Then he heard it, the distant sound of an engine, too far away to see but getting closer. Jake checked his watch. Nearly midnight, an unusual time for legitimate visitors to be approaching an abandoned ranch. The German shepherd's low growl confirmed his suspicions that whatever was coming wasn't friendly. Jake quickly gathered the sheriff's documents and returned them to their hiding place, then prepared for the possibility that he and the dog might need to leave the house quickly. The engine sound grew louder, and Jake could determine that it was a single vehicle moving slowly up the valley road without headlights. "Looks like someone doesn't want to advertise their visit," Jake murmured to his companion. "Question is, are they here for the same reason we are, or are they here because of us?" The German shepherd's continued agitation suggested the answer wasn't good news. After 20 years of protecting the secrets hidden at Clearwater Ranch, the dog had learned to recognize the sounds and behaviors of people who meant harm. Its warning was clear: danger was approaching, and the time for passive investigation was ending. Jake Morrison, former Army medic and reluctant hermit, was about to discover that some secrets are worth killing for, even 20 years after they were supposed to be buried forever. The vehicle that approached in the darkness turned out to be a false alarm, a lost hunter who had taken a wrong turn and was looking for directions back to the main road. But the incident served as a wake-up call for Jake, reminding him that his position at the ranch was fundamentally vulnerable. If the people responsible for the Clearwater murders were still active, it was only a matter of time before they returned to check on their interests. The next morning brought a discovery that changed everything Jake thought he understood about the situation. The German shepherd led him to a cave system hidden in the rocky outcropping behind the ranch house, accessible only through a narrow opening concealed by fallen boulders. Inside, Sheriff Clearwater had created a secondary cache of evidence that went far beyond his investigation into cattle theft and land acquisition. The cave contained maps, photographs and documents that revealed the true scope of what the sheriff had uncovered in the weeks before his death. The cattle rustling had been a relatively minor component of a criminal enterprise that included money laundering, political corruption, and systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the organization's interests. The land acquisition scheme was just one profit center in an operation that had tentacles reaching across the entire region. Most shocking of all was a surveyor's map that Jake found rolled in a waterproof tube, stamped with official seals and dated just months before the Clearwater murders. The map showed detailed plans for the Teton Valley Resort development, complete with elevation surveys, environmental impact assessments, and infrastructure layouts. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the notation in the corner: "Final phase contingent on Clearwater property acquisition. Eliminate all obstacles." Your father knew they were planning to kill him, Jake told the German shepherd as he studied the damning document. That's why he hid all this evidence. He was trying to make sure someone would eventually find the truth. The map revealed the breathtaking scope of the planned development. The resort would cover nearly 50,000 acres, transforming the entire valley into a playground for the wealthy while displacing every remaining family ranch in the region. The economic benefits would flow to a small group of investors, while the environmental and social costs would be borne by the local community. It was exactly the kind of project that required eliminating inconvenient obstacles, like honest sheriffs and their families. But the cave contained more recent evidence as well. suggesting that Sheriff Clearwater's investigation had been more thorough than Jake had initially realized. Hidden beneath the older documents, Jake found materials that appeared to have been added more recently: photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that documented continuing criminal activity in the years following the Clearwater murders. The German Shepherd's behavior as Jake examined these materials was revealing. The dog showed no surprise at their existence, suggesting it had been aware of their location all along. More significantly, the animal's reactions indicated it had been returning to this cave regularly, possibly adding to the collection of evidence over the years. You've been continuing his work, Jake realized. All these years, you've been watching, gathering evidence, waiting for someone to find it. The most recent additions to the cave's contents painted a disturbing picture of ongoing criminal activity. Photographs showed the same men Jake had observed surveying the ranch, along with others he didn't recognize. Newspaper clippings documented the accidental deaths of 3 more ranchers who had refused to sell their properties to Morrison interests. Handwritten notes, in a careful script that could only belong to someone with law enforcement training, tracked patterns of corruption that extended into the current decade. Jake felt a chill as he realized what these materials implied. The German Shepherd hadn't just been guarding memories of old crimes. It had been actively investigating ongoing criminal activity for 20 years. The dog had somehow learned to document evidence, to track patterns, and to preserve information that could eventually be used to bring the criminals to justice. The implications were staggering. This animal possessed intelligence and dedication that went far beyond normal canine capabilities. It had maintained a 20-year investigation into its family's murder, systematically gathering evidence while avoiding detection by the very people it was investigating. The German Shepherd was, in every meaningful sense, carrying on Sheriff Clearwater's work. As Jake studied the accumulated evidence, he began to understand why the ranch continued to attract attention from Morrison's people. They knew that Sheriff Clearwater had been investigating their operation, and they suspected he might have hidden evidence somewhere on his property. The periodic visits Jake had observed weren't just casual monitoring. They were systematic searches for materials that could destroy the criminal enterprise. But what the criminals didn't know was that their searches had been observed and documented by a witness they thought was dead. The German Shepherd's evidence cache contained photographs of every person who had visited the ranch over the past several years, complete with license plate numbers and behavioral patterns that would be invaluable to any serious investigation. Jake realized he was looking at the most comprehensive documentation of organized criminal activity he had ever seen. The German Shepherd had created a case file that would make any FBI investigator weep with joy. But the question remained: how could Jake get this evidence to people who could act on it without alerting the criminals to its existence? The answer came to him as he studied the most recent additions to the cave. The German Shepherd had been preparing for this moment for years, systematically organizing the evidence in a way that would make sense to anyone who found it. The dog had been waiting for someone like Jake, someone with the skills and determination to take the investigation to its logical conclusion. As if sensing Jake's understanding, the German Shepherd moved to a specific spot in the cave and began digging at the rocky floor. After a few moments, it uncovered a small metal box that contained the most valuable evidence of all: recordings of conversations between Harold Morrison and his associates, captured by surveillance equipment that Sheriff Clearwater had installed shortly before his death. Jake listened to portions of the recordings with growing amazement. The conversations detailed plans for eliminating the Clearwater family, disposing of their bodies, and covering up the murders. They also revealed the broader scope of the criminal organization, including connections to politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders across the region. "This is it," Jake whispered to the German Shepherd. "This is everything we need to bring them down. Your sheriff father would be proud of what you've accomplished." The dog's tail wagged once. The controlled movement Jake had learned indicated satisfaction and agreement. After 20 years of patient work, the German Shepherd had finally found the partner it needed to complete its mission. Jake Morrison, former army medic and reluctant hermit, was about to become the instrument of justice that the Clearwater family had been waiting for since that terrible night 2 decades ago. Jake was cataloguing the audio recordings when the German Shepherd's sudden bark of alarm shattered the cave's silence. The dog had frozen at the cave entrance, every muscle tensed, staring toward the ranch buildings with an intensity that made Jake's combat instincts surge to full alert. Through the narrow opening, he could see 3 vehicles approaching the ranch, the same convoy that had surveyed the property days earlier. But this time, they moved with the purposeful urgency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "They're back," Jake whispered, quickly securing the evidence containers. "And they're not here for another casual survey." But as Jake prepared to observe the visitors from concealment, the German Shepherd did something that shocked him. Instead of maintaining its defensive posture, the dog suddenly relaxed, its tail beginning to wag. For a moment, Jake thought the animal might be confused, but then he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the men emerging from the vehicles was calling out a name. "Rex!" "Here, boy." "Rex, where are you?" The German Shepherd, Rex, began moving toward the cave entrance, drawn by the familiar voice. Jake grabbed the animal's collar, holding it back while his mind raced to process what he was witnessing. Someone among their visitors knew the dog by name, knew it was alive, and had been looking for it. Jake used his binoculars to study the men more carefully, and what he saw changed everything. He thought he understood about the situation. The man calling Rex's name was young, probably in his late 20s, with facial features that bore a striking resemblance to the family photograph Jake had found in the brass locket. The resemblance was unmistakable. This was a Clearwater, someone who should have died 20 years ago. "That's impossible," Jake muttered. But Rex's reaction left no doubt. The dog was straining against Jake's grip. Desperate to reach someone it clearly recognized and loved. As Jake watched, the young man continued calling for Rex while his companions searched the ranch buildings. Their behavior wasn't that of criminals looking for evidence to destroy. It was that of investigators conducting a careful, professional search. Jake noticed that one of them carried federal law enforcement credentials visible on his belt, while another had the bearing and equipment of a forensic specialist. The plot twist hit Jake like a physical blow. Rex hadn't been guarding the scene of his family's murder for 20 years. He had been waiting for family members to return. The Clearwater murders had been staged, the bodies never found because some of the family had survived. The German Shepherd's vigil hadn't been motivated by grief alone, but by the hope that someday his people would come back for him. Jake released his hold on Rex's collar, and the dog immediately bounded from the cave toward the ranch buildings. The reunion that followed was emotional even at a distance, the young man dropping to his knees as Rex launched himself into his arms, both of them clearly overwhelmed by an encounter 20 years in the making. From his concealed position, Jake watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. The murders at Clearwater Ranch had been an elaborate deception designed to allow the sheriff and his family to disappear while their investigation continued from the shadows. Sheriff Tom Clearwater hadn't been killed. He had been forced to fake his death and assume a new identity to protect his family and continue building a case against Morrison's criminal organization. The implications were staggering. For 20 years, while Morrison and his associates believed they had eliminated the threat posed by Sheriff Clearwater's investigation, the sheriff had actually been working with federal law enforcement to build an ironclad case against them. The evidence Rex had been guarding wasn't just historical documentation. It was an active part of an ongoing federal investigation that was finally reaching its culmination. Jake remained hidden while the reunion continued, but his military training kept him alert to the broader situation. If the surviving Clearwaters were here, if federal agents were involved, then something significant was about to happen. The timing suggested that 20 years of patient investigation were about to pay off in arrests and prosecutions that would dismantle Morrison's entire criminal empire. But Jake's analysis of the tactical situation revealed a problem. The federal team's vehicles were positioned in a way that left them vulnerable to observation and potential attack from the high ground around the valley. If Morrison's people were monitoring the ranch, and Jake's experience suggested they were, then the law enforcement operation was walking into a trap. His concerns proved justified when he spotted movement on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Through his binoculars, Jake could see armed men taking positions that would allow them to control the valley's only exit route. The federal team below was focused on their emotional reunion and evidence gathering, unaware that they were being surrounded by the very criminals they were trying to apprehend. Jake faced a crucial decision. He could remain hidden and hope that the federal agents would recognize their danger in time to respond effectively. Or he could reveal his presence and warn them that they were walking into an ambush, thereby exposing himself to criminal retaliation and legal complications. His military training told him that the tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating, and that decisive action would be required to prevent a massacre. The decision became easier when Jake realized something that chilled him. Hidden among the evidence Rex had been guarding was a modern cell phone, not 20 years old, but recent enough to have GPS tracking and digital communication capabilities. Jake examined the device more carefully and discovered that it belonged to someone named Maria Santos. According to the contact information stored in its memory, a quick review of the phone's recent activity revealed the horrifying truth. Maria Santos had been a federal investigator who had gotten too close to the Morrison organization's current operations. Her communications with the Clearwater team had been intercepted, her location tracked, and according to the final entries in the phone's log, she had been killed just weeks ago. The phone's presence in Rex's evidence cache meant that the dog had witnessed her murder and added her phone to his collection of evidence. Jake realized that the Morrison organization wasn't just aware of the federal investigation. They were actively hunting and killing federal agents to protect their operations. The reunion taking place at the ranch wasn't a culmination of 20 years of patient justice. It was a trap designed to eliminate the remaining threats to Morrison's criminal empire. Rex seemed to sense the change in the tactical situation. The dog's initial joy at being reunited with his surviving family gave way to the alert tension Jake had learned to recognize as a warning of immediate danger. Rex moved between his family members and the high ground where Jake had spotted the armed men, communicating the same protective instincts that had tried to save his family 20 years earlier. Jake made his decision. 20 years of patient investigation, 20 years of Rex's faithful vigil, and the lives of federal agents and the surviving Clearwater family members were all at stake. Jake Morrison, former Army medic and reluctant hermit, was about to step back into the world of combat, not because he sought it, but because justice and innocent lives depended on his willingness to fight. The German shepherd looked back toward the cave, where Jake remained hidden, and their eyes met across the distance. In that moment, Jake understood that Rex had been waiting not just for his family to return, but for someone with the skills to protect them when the final confrontation came. The dog had found his family, but he still needed his soldier. Jake began moving toward the ranch buildings, his rifle ready and his combat training fully engaged. The stage was set for a battle 20 years in the making, where the outcome would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether the Morrison organization's reign of terror would claim its most important victims yet. Jake moved through the timber with the practiced silence of someone whose life had once depended on remaining undetected. His approach to the ranch required him to cross open ground that would expose him to the gunmen positioned on the ridge. but his military experience had taught him to use terrain and timing to minimize that exposure. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen, providing some concealment as he closed the distance to the federal agent's position. Rex spotted Jake's approach first, the dog's ears pricking forward as he recognized the man who had become his partner in the investigation. The German shepherd's reaction caught the attention of the young Clearwater, who turned to see Jake emerging from the tree line with his rifle ready and his bearing unmistakably military. "Federal agents," Jake called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "You need to know you're walking into an ambush. Armed men on the ridge, probably more at the valley exit. This whole situation is a setup." The man who turned to face him was indeed a Clearwater. Jake could see the family resemblance to the photograph from the locket, though 20 years of federal law enforcement work had hardened his features. He wore a bulletproof vest with FBI credentials clearly visible, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before Rex's enthusiastic greeting convinced him that Jake was not an immediate threat. "Agent David Clearwater, FBI," the man identified himself, his voice carrying the cautious authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations.
"You are?"
"Jake Morrison, former Army medic," Jake replied, keeping his rifle pointed down but ready. "I've been investigating your family's case independently. Found your dog and a lot of evidence your father left behind. But right now we have bigger problems." Jake quickly outlined his tactical assessment of their situation. The gunman on the ridge commanded the high ground and could rain fire down on anyone trying to leave the valley through the main road. The ranch buildings offered some protection, but they could easily become a killing field if the attackers coordinated their assault properly. Most critically, the federal team's vehicles were positioned in the open, making them vulnerable to immediate attack. "How many shooters did you count?" asked the second federal agent, a woman in her 40s, whose equipment and bearing suggested she was the team's tactical specialist. "At least 6 on the ridge. Probably more I haven't spotted," Jake reported. "Professional placement, good fields of fire. They've been planning this for a while." He paused, considering how much to reveal about his investigation. "I found evidence suggesting they killed a federal agent named Maria Santos recently. They know about your investigation, and they're not planning to take prisoners." Agent Clearwater's expression darkened at the mention of Maria Santos. "Agent Santos was my partner. She disappeared 3 weeks ago while investigating Morrison's current operations." He studied Jake with increased intensity. "You said you found evidence. What kind of evidence?" Jake made a quick decision to trust the federal agents with the full scope of what he and Rex had discovered. "Your father wasn't just investigating cattle theft 20 years ago. He uncovered a criminal organization with connections reaching to the state and federal level. Rex here has been continuing that investigation, gathering evidence for 20 years. We've got recordings, photographs, documents, everything you need to prosecute the entire network." "Rex?" Agent Clearwater looked down at the German shepherd with new understanding. "You mean your dog has been running the most successful undercover operation in law enforcement history," Jake confirmed. "He's documented every criminal who's visited this ranch, collected evidence of ongoing murders, and preserved your father's original investigation materials. The question is whether we're going to live long enough to use any of it." The third member of the federal team, who had been scanning the ridge with binoculars, confirmed Jake's tactical assessment. "Multiple shooters, well positioned. They're waiting for something, probably a signal to begin coordinated fire." Agent Clearwater pulled out a radio and began calling for backup, but Jake's expression warned him that help wouldn't arrive in time. "How long for reinforcements?" Jake asked. "Minimum 40 minutes for ground units, maybe 20 for air support," Clearwater replied. "But air support won't help much if we're pinned down in buildings." Jake's military mind was already formulating a plan, drawing on years of experience in asymmetric warfare and tactical situations where being outnumbered required superior planning and execution. "We need to change the dynamic," he said. "Right now they have all the advantages, high ground, numbers, prepared positions. We need to force them to react instead of letting them execute their plan." Rex seemed to understand that combat was imminent. The dog moved between Jake and Agent Clearwater, positioning itself to provide early warning of approaching threats while maintaining contact with both men. Jake was impressed by the animal's tactical awareness. 20 years of survival in hostile territory had taught Rex lessons that most military working dogs never learned. "What are you thinking?" Agent Clearwater asked, recognizing the tone of someone developing a tactical plan. Jake studied the ranch layout with the eye of someone who had spent years turning disadvantageous terrain into defensive positions. "The barn gives us elevated positions and multiple exit routes. The house offers solid cover but could become a trap. The key is the cave system behind the main building. Rex showed me a network of passages that could give us mobility while keeping us protected. You want to use the caves as a tactical advantage?" The female agent asked. "More than that," Jake replied. "I want to use them to get behind their positions. They're expecting us to hunker down and wait for rescue. Instead, we go on the offensive." Agent Clearwater looked skeptical. 3 agents and a civilian against professional killers with superior positions. 4 combatants, Jake corrected, gesturing toward Rex. "This dog has more field experience than most soldiers I've served with. And we have something they don't, intimate knowledge of this terrain, and 20 years' worth of intelligence about their operations." Jake retrieved Sheriff Clearwater's service revolver from its hiding place in the barn, checking the action and confirming that the weapon was still functional despite decades of storage. The weight of the gun felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memory from years of military training. More importantly, it felt like a connection to the man whose investigation had started this entire chain of events. "Your father hid this here 20 years ago," Jake told Agent Clearwater, offering him the revolver. "Seems fitting that his son should be the one to finish what he started." The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. Sheriff Tom Clearwater's service weapon, preserved by his loyal dog for 2 decades, was about to be used in the final confrontation with the criminals who had destroyed his life and threatened his family. Rex seemed to understand the significance as well. Moving to Agent Clearwater's side as if offering his approval of the plan, Jake spent the next several minutes explaining the cave system's layout and the various positions from which they could launch their counterattack. The federal agents were experienced in tactical operations, but Jake's combat experience in Afghanistan provided insights into fighting from positions of disadvantage that proved invaluable. "The key is coordination," Jake emphasized. "They're expecting us to act like law enforcement, by the book defensive, waiting for backup. Instead, we're going to act like soldiers, fast, aggressive, and unpredictable." Rex's sudden alertness interrupted their planning. The dog had frozen in the classic warning posture, staring toward the ridge where Jake had spotted the gunman. Through his binoculars, Jake could see movement among the positions. The attackers were beginning to close in for what they clearly expected to be a one-sided massacre. "Movement on the ridge," Jake reported. "They're getting ready to initiate contact. We need to move now if we're going to get into position." Agent Clearwater made the final decision. "We do this your way, Morrison. But if we survive, you're going to have to explain to a federal prosecutor how a hermit and a dog managed to conduct a 20-year investigation that none of us knew about." Jake checked his rifle one final time and looked at Rex, who was watching him with the intense focus of an animal ready for battle. "One problem at a time, Agent. First we stay alive. Then we make sure justice gets served." The German shepherd's low growl indicated that their time for preparation was ending. After 20 years of waiting, the final confrontation was about to begin. Rex had found his family, Jake had found his purpose, and together they were going to finish the mission that Sheriff Tom Clearwater had started in this very place 2 decades ago. The battle for Clearwater Ranch was about to determine whether justice would triumph or whether the Morrison organization would eliminate the last threats to their criminal empire. Jake Morrison, former Army medic, was ready to discover what he was truly capable of when everything that mattered was on the line. The first shots rang out across the valley, just as Jake and the federal team reached the cave entrance. Rex had removed his makeshift bandage, the bloodied piece of cloth that had marked his injury for so long, dropping it at the threshold as if shedding the last vestige of his wounded years. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on Jake. After 20 years of carrying physical and emotional scars, the German shepherd was finally ready for the confrontation he'd been waiting for. The gunfire came from 3 different positions on the ridge, confirming Jake's assessment that they were facing a coordinated attack by professional killers. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the cave entrance and splintered the wooden walls of the ranch buildings, but the attackers were firing at empty positions. Jake's decision to move the team into the cave system had saved their lives in the opening seconds of the battle. "They're shooting at shadows," Agent Clearwater observed, crouched beside Jake in the cave's main chamber. "They expected us to take defensive positions in the buildings." Jake was already moving deeper into the cave system, following passages that Rex had shown him during their earlier exploration. "That gives us maybe 10 minutes before they realize we're not where they think we are. We need to use that time to get behind their positions." The cave network was more extensive than Jake had initially realized. Rex led them through passages that connected to natural openings scattered across the rocky outcropping behind the ranch. These exits would allow them to emerge at positions the attackers hadn't anticipated, turning the tactical situation in their favor. Agent Sarah Mitchell, the team's tactical specialist, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone experienced in combat operations. She had quickly grasped Jake's strategy and was already positioning herself to provide covering fire when they emerged from the caves. Agent Clearwater carried his father's revolver alongside his service weapon, the symbolism giving him focus that Jake recognized from his own military experience. Rex's behavior during their movement through the caves was remarkable. The dog seemed to understand not just the immediate tactical situation, but the deeper significance of what was happening. This wasn't just a law enforcement operation. It was the completion of a mission that had consumed 20 years of his life. Every movement, every alert signal, every tactical decision reflected an intelligence and dedication that went far beyond normal animal behavior. The cave system's main advantage was that it allowed them to approach the ridge from an unexpected direction. While the gunmen focused their attention on the ranch buildings below, Jake's team could emerge behind their positions and catch them in a crossfire that would neutralize their numerical and positional advantages. But as they moved through the passages, Jake discovered something that changed his understanding of the tactical situation. Hidden in a side chamber were supplies and equipment that clearly didn't belong to Sheriff Clearwater's original investigation. Recent camping gear, modern weapons, and communication equipment suggested that someone else had been using the cave system as a base of operations. "Morrison's people have been here," Jake realized, examining the equipment. "They've been using these caves to monitor the ranch without being seen." Agent Clearwater's expression darkened as he studied the communications equipment. "This isn't just an ambush. They've been planning this operation for weeks, maybe months. They knew we were coming." Rex's sudden alertness confirmed their worst fears. The dog had frozen at the junction of 2 passages, staring deeper into the cave system with the tension that Jake had learned to recognize as a warning of immediate danger. Someone else was in the caves with them, and based on Rex's reaction, it wasn't friendly. The confirmation came in the form of muzzle flashes from the passage ahead. Someone had positioned themselves to ambush Jake's team as they tried to use the caves for tactical advantage. The narrow passages that Jake had hoped would provide protection suddenly became kill zones, where movement meant exposure to enemy fire. Jake's military training kicked in automatically. He positioned Agent Mitchell to provide covering fire, while he and Agent Clearwater moved to flank the shooters in the caves. Rex seemed to understand the tactical evolution and took position to warn of additional threats from other passages. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced in Afghanistan. The confined space of the caves meant that every shot was amplified to deafening levels, and muzzle flashes created strobing patterns of light and shadow that made target identification nearly impossible. But Jake's combat experience gave him advantages that the criminal gunman lacked. He understood how to use the acoustic properties of enclosed spaces, how to move efficiently in limited visibility, and how to coordinate with partners in high-stress situations. Agent Clearwater proved that federal training could translate effectively to combat situations. His marksmanship was excellent, and his tactical awareness allowed him to anticipate enemy movements in ways that complemented Jake's more aggressive approach. The combination of military and law enforcement expertise created a synergy that began to turn the battle in their favor. Rex's contribution went beyond early warning. The dog seemed to understand the tactical flow of the engagement and positioned himself to cut off escape routes while staying clear of friendly fire. When one of the gunmen tried to retreat deeper into the cave system, Rex was waiting, his attacks swift and decisive enough to eliminate the threat without requiring backup from the human combatants. The first phase of the battle ended with the cave system secured and 3 enemy gunmen neutralized. But Jake's tactical assessment of their situation remained grim. The main force was still positioned on the ridge, and now they knew that their ambush had failed. The real test was about to begin. The sound of helicopters approaching the valley changed everything about the tactical situation. Jake's first thought was that federal reinforcements had arrived ahead of schedule, but Rex's reaction warned him that the aircraft weren't bringing help. The German shepherd's hackles rose as he stared toward the sound, communicating the same wariness he'd shown toward every other aspect of the criminal organization's operations. Agent Clearwater confirmed Jake's suspicions after checking his radio. "Those aren't ours. No federal aircraft scheduled for this area today." Through the cave entrance, Jake could see 2 helicopters moving up the valley, civilian aircraft that had been modified with external equipment suggesting military or law enforcement capabilities. But the timing of their arrival, coordinated with the ground assault, indicated they were part of Morrison's operation rather than legitimate law enforcement. "They're bringing reinforcements," Jake realized, his combat experience allowing him to assess the tactical implications quickly. "And they're going to use air assets to flush us out of positions we can't reach from the ground." The helicopter's approach forced Jake to completely reconsider their strategy. The cave system that had provided them with tactical advantage was now a potential trap. If Morrison's people could use aircraft to monitor and attack the cave entrances, Jake's team would be pinned underground with limited options for escape or counterattack. But as Jake watched the aircraft maneuver over the ranch, he noticed something that gave him hope. One of the helicopters carried external equipment that looked suspiciously like federal law enforcement gear, the kind of specialized surveillance and communication systems that would be far too expensive for a criminal organization to acquire legally. Agent Mitchell had reached the same conclusion. "Those aircraft are stolen federal assets," she reported after studying them through binoculars. "The lead helicopter is from our Denver field office. It disappeared from a secure hangar 3 weeks ago." Jake felt pieces clicking into place. The criminal organization wasn't just fighting federal investigators, they were using stolen federal equipment and possibly compromised federal personnel to conduct their operations. The scope of corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into the very agencies responsible for investigating and prosecuting organized crime. The revelation explained how Morrison's people had stayed ahead of federal investigations for so many years. They had inside access to law enforcement intelligence, equipment, and operational planning. Agent Santos's murder hadn't been just about eliminating a troublesome investigator. It had been about maintaining access to federal resources that made the criminal organization virtually untouchable. Rex's behavior during this realization was telling. The dog moved to a specific position in the cave, where he had a clear view of both the aircraft and the approaches to their position. His tactical awareness suggested he had observed similar operations before, possibly during the period when Agent Santos had been investigating Morrison's current activities. Rex was there when they killed Agent Santos, Jake realized, watching the dog's focused attention on the helicopters. He saw them use those aircraft before. Agent Clearwater studied his canine partner with new understanding. You've been documenting their current operations, haven't you, boy? Not just the old crimes, but what they're doing now. The helicopters began deploying personnel at strategic positions around the valley, confirming that Jake's team was facing a much larger force than initially estimated. But the aircraft deployment also revealed something crucial: the federal badge visible on one of the men rappelling. From the lead helicopter, Jake used his binoculars to get a clearer look at the badge and felt his blood turn cold. The man directing the helicopter operations was wearing legitimate federal credentials, but his coordination with the ground assault teams made it clear he was working with the criminal organization rather than against it. "We've got a bigger problem," Jake reported to Agent Clearwater. "There's a federal agent coordinating with Morrison's people. This isn't just corruption, it's active collaboration." The implications were staggering. The federal investigation that Agent Clearwater had been conducting wasn't just compromised. It had been orchestrated by people working both sides of the law. The 20-year investigation that had consumed Rex's life and brought Jake into the conflict was being used to identify and eliminate the last threats to a criminal organization that had thoroughly infiltrated federal law enforcement. But Jake's military experience had taught him that desperate situations often created unexpected opportunities. The criminals' confidence in their superior numbers and federal backing might make them careless about tactical fundamentals. And Jake had an advantage they couldn't anticipate. Rex's 20 years of surveillance had given him intelligence about their operations that even the corrupted federal agents didn't possess. The German shepherd seemed to sense that the final phase of the battle was beginning. He moved to Jake's side and looked up at him with the same intense focus that had characterized their entire partnership. In that moment, Jake understood that Rex had been preparing for this confrontation not just for 20 years, but for every day since Jake had first bandaged his wounds by the campfire. Agent Clearwater checked his father's service weapon one final time and looked at Jake with the determination of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether 20 years of investigation and sacrifice would result in justice or tragedy. The battle for Clearwater Ranch was entering its final phase, where the outcome would determine whether the truth would finally emerge or be buried forever, along with everyone who had fought to expose it. 6 months after the battle at Clearwater Ranch, Jake Morrison stood in a federal courtroom in Denver, his hand on a Bible as he prepared to give testimony that would complete the longest undercover investigation in law enforcement history. Beside him, wearing a new leather collar engraved with the word hero, Rex waited patiently for his turn to be recognized as the star witness in the most comprehensive, organized crime prosecution the region had ever seen. The trial had been front-page news for weeks, as the full scope of the Morrison organization's criminal enterprise was revealed to the public. Harold Morrison, 3 corrupt federal agents and 17 associates faced charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to theft of federal property and obstruction of justice. The evidence that Rex had gathered over 20 years, combined with the recordings and documents Sheriff Clearwater had hidden before faking his death, provided prosecutors with an ironclad case that defense attorneys couldn't challenge. Agent David Clearwater sat in the gallery, his arm still in a sling from the wounds he'd received during the final confrontation at the ranch. The corrupt federal agents had put up fierce resistance when they realized their operation was collapsing, but Jake's military training and Rex's tactical intelligence had ultimately prevailed. The stolen helicopters had been recovered, the criminal organization dismantled, and the surviving members arrested in coordinated raids across 3 states. The most satisfying moment of Jake's testimony came when he described how Rex had maintained his surveillance operation for 20 years, systematically documenting criminal activity while waiting for the right moment to see justice served. The courtroom fell silent as Jake explained the German Shepherd's dedication, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty to a mission that had consumed most of the dog's life. "In my military experience," Jake told the jury, "I've never seen operational security, tactical awareness, and mission dedication that exceeded what this animal demonstrated over 2 decades of undercover work." Rex didn't just witness crimes, he investigated them, documented them, and preserved evidence with the professionalism of a trained federal agent. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that most defendants chose to plea bargain rather than face trial. Harold Morrison himself, confronted with recordings of his voice-planning murders and orchestrating land theft, accepted a life sentence in exchange for providing information about other criminal organizations he had worked with over the years. But for Jake, the legal proceedings were less important than what had happened to the people and places that had been damaged by 20 years of criminal activity. The Clearwater Ranch had been rebuilt using funds seized from the Morrison organization's assets. Sheriff Tom Clearwater, emerging from 2 decades of witness protection, had returned to oversee the construction of a memorial garden where his family's supposed graves had once been marked. Rex had faced a difficult choice when the investigation concluded. The Clearwater family wanted him to return to domestic life, to spend his remaining years as a beloved pet rather than a working investigator. But Jake had offered an alternative that recognized the dog's exceptional abilities and need for purpose. The solution came in the form of a partnership with the local search and rescue organization. Rex's tracking skills, intelligence, and tactical awareness made him invaluable for finding lost hikers, avalanche victims, and missing persons in the Colorado mountain country. Jake had accepted a position as the team's medical specialist, allowing him to work alongside Rex while using his own skills to help others. The partnership had proven remarkably successful. Rex's ability to analyze complex terrain, interpret human behavior, and maintain focus during extended operations made him the most effective search and rescue dog in the region's history. Jake's medical training and mountain survival skills complemented the dog's abilities, creating a team that had already saved 17 lives in their first 6 months of operation. More importantly for Jake, the work had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: a sense of purpose that connected him to other people without overwhelming him with the social demands he still found difficult. The mountains remained his home, but now his isolation served a larger mission rather than simple self-protection. On this particular afternoon, after completing his testimony, Jake drove back to the valley where his partnership with Rex had begun. The Clearwater Ranch was bustling with activity as contractors put finishing touches on the memorial center that would preserve the story of Sheriff Clearwater's investigation and Rex's remarkable vigil. Jake parked near the lake where he had first seen signs of the violence that had shaped so many lives. Rex jumped from the truck and immediately began his familiar patrol of the property, checking the locations where he had once hidden evidence and guarded secrets. But the dog's behavior had changed over the past months. The constant vigilance had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. Sarah's music box sat in a place of honor in the memorial center, its delicate melody playing Amazing Grace for visitors who wanted to understand the human cost of organized crime. The music no longer made Rex whine with grief. Instead, he seemed to find comfort in the sound, as if it connected him to memories of happiness rather than loss. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Jake found himself sitting on the rebuilt porch of the ranch house. Rex stretched out beside him in the peaceful posture of a dog whose long mission had finally been completed. The German Shepherd's new collar caught the sunlight. The word hero, clearly visible to anyone who might wonder about the remarkable animal's story. Jake scratched Rex behind the ears and looked out over the valley that had tested them both so thoroughly. Tomorrow, They would return to the search and rescue work that had become their new calling, using skills learned in combat and investigation to save lives rather than fight battles. It was a better ending than either of them had expected when a wounded dog had stumbled into a hermit's campfire on a September evening that felt like a lifetime ago. Rex's tail tapped against the porch boards once. The controlled movement Jake had learned indicated satisfaction and agreement. After 20 years of carrying the weight of justice on his shoulders, the German shepherd had finally found peace. And so had the reluctant hermit who had chosen to help him see that mission through to its completion.